which is going to be presented by George Walters. George is going to be pulling up his screen here as I go through the introduction. He's been at Microsoft for 17 years and is currently Director, Data and AI Specialist. He started in enterprise support, pre-sales, partner, and lately is in enterprise sales with Fortune 10 health-related customers. His focus historically has been on SQL Server with cloud and analytics for the last 10 years. So with that, George, we can see your screen. Go ahead and come off mute and take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt, GPT. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for coming on. And I believe there is a quick trivia quiz. If that could be posted, we just want to gather a little bit of information on some of your versions of SQL Server that you're running. Why? Because this is going to be a discussion about modernization of your data. So if everybody would just, pick, it's multi-select, you can pick the versions that you have, that you know of, running in your data centers. And don't worry, we won't share this outside. And look at that. Oh, 2014 and 2012 are high. I see SQL 2000 out there. I don't doubt that, because this is healthcare and sometimes things are just a little bit behind for good reasons sometimes. And sometimes it may just be time to think through things a little differently. That's awesome. Appreciate the feedback. So with that, I shall jump into this presentation on doing more with less. Can everybody see my slides, first of all? Migrating your data estate. We're good? Good.
Yep.
Fantastic. So a lot of things were talked about today, a lot of the exciting things about AI and getting value out of your data and, the involvement of the people. These AI models are very shiny. How do you get there? You need people to help do prompt engineering and all kinds of other interesting things. These are deep dive subjects. All about the products you have. And of course, we're in healthcare, and I hate to say that products are people and outcomes, right? So that's what we want to improve. Operations, just keeping the facility running. IT operations, for a lot of you, might be a familiar topic. And then customers/patients, right? Or who is your customer? Is it the head of medical, right? So how can you improve these things, create value for your customers, get your staff engaged, improve revenue performance? Really? Data migration is going to improve revenue performance? Well, we'll talk about some of these topics. So with that, I'll just build out the slide. This is kind of a spectrum of data modernization and how you leverage the data in your organization. I'd say, a lot of folks here, you can please comment in the chat or go and submit to that form some of your ideas around this and where you are and where you want to go. In other words, what is your plan to move from a reactive world? You've got your local data, you're just using it for reactive things, to getting to it where it's centrally managed to inform the business of where you are, right? Let's say you're a major hospital system. Are those multiple EMRs of data tied together at all? And the outside systems to help give a bigger picture to the chief revenue officer or other important people within the organization, right? Getting to that predictive nature. I threw in the chat something there before about predictive staffing levels. That's a real project that has been out there for a couple of years. That's more deterministic AI and ML rather than this generative AI stuff that you have seen today. But that's where things can really shift and make it a lot easier to adopt. And then finally, transformation. So once you get to that predictive nature and you have that full insights, getting to better business outcomes, patient outcomes, and so forth. But as we all know, in the IT industry, data realities are complex, and I'll just kind of build this out, right? What data do you have? What's your compliance exposure? That questionnaire tells me a little bit, because Microsoft generally has 10 years of extended support after 5 years of mainstream support on our products. Last I checked is the year 2023. So we'll just do math and take a look at your products. Some of you need help, and that's okay. We can get there. How do you get your people access to the data, right? If they're locked into those pizza boxes, the servers that were installed 10 or 15 years ago, how are you going to improve on that, right? So we'll talk about some of the ways we can help you with that. I believe this slide really talks some of the fun things which are on top, like new applications, getting the GitHub Copilot. It's extra productivity for your developers. That's really good. The AI, making sure that you can leverage some of these services. The generative AI is the shiny stuff, but maybe some of the more productive ways to leverage some of the other services in our suite of cognitive services, like Form Recognizer to go and grab your PDFs that are incoming or faxes, right? Digitize them automatically instead of having people keyboard them, right? The customer service use case is phenomenal. But again, we still have operational systems out there and we have to deal with them. And how can we manage them better? How we can alleviate your workloads or your people's workloads around this so that they could be more flexible and the organization can get towards that transformation, right? Super. And so with that, there's infrastructure tools are on the bottom, funny enough, but it's almost foundational, right? So that said, I'm going to be talking a lot about operational databases. So as you see on this slide on the left is Azure SQL. There's a whole range of things from VMs to platform services and so forth. Microsoft has been heavily invested in open source for about 10 years now. Funny enough, we got a new CEO, Satya Nadella, a mere 10 years ago. And shockingly, or not so shockingly, open source is no longer a bad word. Linux is a good word. In 2013, we walked onto the stage at Oracle Open World and announced Linux and Oracle VMs on Azure. I thought the earth shook because I've been around Microsoft about 17 years. And then following that, 2 years later, we started having previews of SQL Server on Linux. So that's where Microsoft has evolved from. And we want to be able to capture and manage your data wherever it is. So when it comes to data modernization, there's certainly a lot of choices and there's a lot of numbers on these slides that kind of talk like great things. SQL Server is, of course, a database server system that's been around for, well, 30 years or so. The Azure SQL family includes that, plus the platform services, Azure SQL Database and SQL Managed Instance. And I'll talk in depth about that in a little bit. The open source ones like Postgres, MySQL, and MariaDB. Maybe in your head is, well, that's interesting, George. Do customers in healthcare put their operational systems in Azure? Well, the answer is yes. And in fact, I do know of a certain, we'll say, healthcare company that has put thousands of SQL Server VMs into Azure Infrastructure as a Service to reduce their workload versus on-premises and give them more flexibility and the ability to grow. I know of another customer who then took their MySQL databases on-prem and migrated to our platform Azure MySQL to gain that flexibility and scalability that they needed, as well as getting away from endless patching cycles would be the nice way to say some of these things. We do have non-relational databases that are first party like Cosmos DB. This was once upon a time called DocumentDB, like JSON, but it's since expanded into graph capabilities. It has a SQL interface. It has a MongoDB interface. So if you think about, it has a Cassandra interface. So if you're leveraging any of those workloads, we do have a platform which is fully managed, which has some of the highest SLAs and has built-in redundancy and multiple consistency levels available. And then, of course, in-memory, most people know what Redis is, but it's an in-memory caching type of database, and we do have that available as well. It says on this slide there's 7 million databases in Azure SQL. I'm sure that number actually keeps growing based on the fact that I know some of my peers are doing work. 100 trillion transactions per day on Azure Cosmos DB. Wherever we have an Azure region or data center, Cosmos DB is there. It is a ring zero service, just like Azure SQL is, as much as VMs and other things are. It's a very basic fundamental service. 17 billion transactions per day on one application in Azure database for MySQL. So that tells you something. That's some pretty good scale. Cool. When it comes to SQL Server specifically, where are you at? Do you have an ISV application that is just, this is what it is, go and install it on a VM, don't do anything else to it. You need operating system access. Well, that's going to be SQL Server on VMs. Lift and shift it, no problem. You will still have to patch the OS and so forth. But being in Azure, we actually have add-ins that add some manageability features to that, and also makes it a little bit simpler for you to automate patching, high availability scenarios, and automate that sort of stuff to make it a little bit easier on you. Managed instance is kind of like, for those that know SQL Server availability groups that started in SQL 2012. This is like that, but managed by us and on a continually updating platform. So it also has a SQL agent, and it has cross-database querying capabilities. This allows a lot of lift and shift scenarios where you do not need the operating system access. So this is a way that you can alleviate your workloads. Feel free to raise your hand if you like patching your systems, your switches, your fiber, your SAN. Feel free to raise your hands. Go ahead, and I'll see how many hands are raised. In the meantime, I'm just going to keep talking because I think Lee, of course, is a jokester, and he's raising his hand. I love it. Thank you, sir. But that's what it is. A lot of people say, well, you know, I'm an operational DBA and I'm worried about losing my job. Well, do you really like patching? I literally said this to a customer of mine, which I'll feature in a few minutes. They migrated to Azure SQL database, 33,000 databases. They reduced their 80-hour frustrating work weeks on-prem to 40 hours a week with a lot less frustrations, with testing before deployment and scripting things. So it's a mindset sometimes to help with this. And then when it comes to IoT, we do have SQL Server built into a little container that can be on an IoT device and deployed and patched and managed remotely out there. That is a real thing as well. So when we talk about this, why would I do it? Well, do you have an ROI, right? We saw some reports out here that 238% total return on investment 3 years after investing in migrating to Azure SQL database, managed databases. That's pretty good. 25% increase in productivity for IT teams. Well, if you have a team of 4, suddenly you have a 5th person helping you out. Think of it that way, right? Do you need to get more done? And I hate to say it, with less. These have been tough times. Microsoft also has had some. So we need to think about how we can leverage our tools to help us, help the companies that we're working at. Productivity for in-house DBAs. I was a DBA, hands-on back in the day, racking and stacking stuff 20 years ago at a startup. And somehow I got here. And I could tell you that the modern tools that we have are phenomenal. And the things that are in the cloud to help detect things like SQL injection and other things through Defender for Cloud are pretty amazing. And then, of course, avoiding hardware, network, and all that stuff. During the pandemic, the supply chain issues were causing people serious frustration. They couldn't get on site. They couldn't rack and stack servers. Then there was that silly chip shortage thing, which is a whole nother story. And so how do you get the work done? Maybe you can leverage a cloud. Okay. But of course, I hate to say that the right answer is Azure, but we do have a lot of cost considerations when it comes to SQL Server. You can bring your investment in your SQL Server licenses with software assurance to Azure, and it cuts down the compute cost, and it costs less overall. And then, of course, then you can buy into reserved instances, is what we call it, reserved capacity, 1 year or 3 year reserved capacity to get some tremendous savings. And I know that there's one 3-letter cloud up here. It could be the other 3-letter cloud. Same idea. But George, there's some servers I just need to keep on-prem. Maybe I'm a med device maker and I've got to factory in Costa Rica, and I got to have a server there capturing data operationally. I can't, there's no Azure region in Costa Rica. What do you do? Well, we can help you. We have this thing called Azure Arc. Arc gives the cloud tools, some of the cloud tools you saw, as well as others, to manage your servers and look at cost comparisons and install just a little agent on-prem. And it can report back. It can also do things like leverage the security features within Azure on-prem. What about that license thing I talk about? Sometimes people hate that, and maybe they just want to run a license on-prem for 6 months. There's not really an easy choice there. There's subscription licenses, but it's kind of a pain. With Azure Arc, you can pay as you go on-prem. That's one less step for procurement to get involved if you have that budget flexibility. As well, you can integrate with single sign-on. Azure Active Directory is now a native feature within SQL 2022 as an on-prem installation or whatever. So think about that as well. And these can manage your servers back to SQL 2012. It gives you one pane of glass to your whole estate, and sometimes that's an ease of administering and management as well. Okay. So why else would I push my machines into Azure? I talked about that 10-year lifespan on our products. Well, we're going to give you that little grace period known as 3 extra years of extended support in Azure if you move those workloads into Azure. So if you're sitting there staring down at that SQL 2012 server and you're like, oh shoot, it's about to go out and I need 2 years to migrate it, that's okay. Move it to Azure and you'll get that extended support, okay? Also, moving into Azure gives you a few other things. You get another DR copy of SQL Server with your SQL Server licensing in Azure versus on-prem. So that gives you more resiliency for your infrastructure. One other thing about the cost in Azure, with a virtual machine, you can bring your Windows licenses to Azure. And that also cuts down your spend tremendously. Yes, other clouds, you can bring SQL Server to them. That's great. But the Windows VM, that cost reduction really does make a big difference. So in an enterprise, that could be a big deal. Or you go to your reseller and buy your Windows Enterprise and do that. Automatic updates. Yes. So with SQL Server for virtual machines is the left column, by the way. And I mentioned that there were additions to make virtual machines more manageable on Azure. Automatic updates, that's pretty good. That way you are alleviated from having to patch things, and you could do it into, time-based things and schedule that out. If you have an HA system, you could say these 3 are in the system and it'll do 1 at a time, things like that. I know I got only 10 minutes left. Developer Edition, you can bring it into Azure, and Developer Edition is usually 0 cost license, so that's good there. We have the compliance offerings that's on the bottom across 60+ regions. That's really good. When you go to Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, that's our platform services, the best total cost of ownership. I know people moving from VMs to managed instance, and even though the compute cost in some cases is a little bit more, their people cost drops dramatically, and they're choosing to do that. So that's just one example that I know of. It's always up to date. We do releases every 2 weeks or so, and they're very small. They do it into limited sets and then out to the main stream. And we see a lot of success there. The highest SLA, 4.5 nines on Azure SQL Database. I think that's pretty good, and 100% business continuity. If you're worried about keeping things safe, your data safe, this is where to think about it, okay? Intelligent performance. Those who are SQL Server people might talk about query optimization or tuning and things like that. We have AI and ML based tools built into Azure SQL Database and now SQL 2022 that can do things like see query plans. If they regress to a bad plan and the query starts acting really weird, it will notice that and can revert it back to a known good plan because it's got a little data warehouse of query plans, for example. That's a feature that can alleviate headache and business impact. So that's something else to think about. We're making our lives simpler if we adopt these tools, and then the business notices fewer problems, and then you have headspace and capability to move forward with the more fun things. Okay. Oh, and then finally, earlier I just tried it because I've tried it for 10 years now. Point and click, and in 5 minutes, I've got a virtual machine with SQL Server installed and ready to go. How long does that take you on-prem? What is the reason why there's huge committees to make projects and define projects and RFPs and all that stuff? Fear of failure. Failure is expensive on premises. In the cloud, you could spend $1,000 playing with some resources. If it fails, oh well, I spent $1,000 versus like $250,000 or $500,000 for any project on-prem, it seems, right? So let's fail fast, fail cheaply, and then have more confidence in what we're doing. And this is it. Whoops, that was it. Don't be afraid if you are on these systems. We can help migrate you between us, our tooling, and our partners. Now I'm going to go into some more fun topics like some of these case studies. RX Health, they migrated to SQL Server on virtual machines. Yes, enhanced security for sensitive health records. It automated scaling and load balancing. That's really good. So they could take, for example, hey, what's my workload going to be? Should I scale out the front end? Should I scale up the back end? Things like that. They could maintain their HL7 protocols. That's super good. And it helped them ease their infrastructure issues, for lack of a better term. Allscripts is a small EMR, and they actually leverage those, what says their hybrid benefit means bring your on-prem licenses to Azure. That's what hybrid benefits are, okay? And so 600 on-prem SQL Server VMs to Azure, keeping their controlling cost. So some people are like, oh, the cost of cloud. They are controlling cost with this. Why? Maybe they don't have to rack and stack the biggest machines in the cloud. They can right size them. If the workload goes up, expand them, contract them, things like that. And you spend in accordance to size at the time. So that might be interesting. Reducing overall cost by 82%. That seems pretty good. And then finally, a non-healthcare case, but nevertheless, critical information, paychecks. And I'll just be blunt that this may or may not be the same customer that had 33,000 databases on-prem and migrated to Azure. And it took a few years before they agreed to a case study. They wanted to make sure it was really running well. That journey started in 2013, very early, got them up and running by 2015, and it supports their time and labor logging application. Again, we can help. Microsoft, some of those on the phone may know that we have great partners that can help with assisting. We have skilling partners as well. And of course, we have this migration and modernization program. So when it comes to this, there's tooling and capabilities around modernizing. And here's a little slide on timeframes, right? Doing a financial analysis, a migration and modernization assessment, which Microsoft can fund. And then once we get to that point, reviewing the outcomes and where you want to go. Then 4A and B is the migration factory. We can actually help with people to help your people properly migrate various workloads. And then of course, 5, 6, and 7 is getting through the migration and getting to operationalization. As you notice, dark blue is Microsoft invested and the green is customer funded. So we're not going to do everything, but we're doing a lot here because giving you that assessment gives you the blueprint of what you have. What is that inventory? What are the real gnarly cases? Some of our inventory partners will actually tell you which servers talk to whom. So if you're in an environment which is inherited and old, that might be very handy. And it's under our Azure migration program. And so feel free to go to azure.com/AMP, especially if you're an enterprise customer. There you go. And that is my presentation, and I'm 4 minutes early, so I'm going to open it for questions.
Yeah, George, there's one that had come in. What's the maturity of virtual machines in Azure for health-related workloads?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So the maturity of it is this. I do know of a certain EMR that migrated out of their physical data centers into VMs in Azure, starting about 4 years ago. And they've been fully migrated for about 2 years now. And that is patient-sensitive records, the whole deal. You want to talk about compliance and scrutiny. Yes.
Excellent. Give an opportunity if anybody else wants to drop a question into chat here for George. But while we're waiting for that, I will thank you, George, for a great presentation here. I know it's always a little bit tough coming in at the end of the day, but you kept it lively, you kept it engaging.
Happy to
Much
help.
appreciated.